I'm one of the senior members, shall we say, kind of headed toward the exit. I actually came to DOPS with the expectation of creating an experimental program, and in particular, neuroimaging studies of psi phenomena and altered states of consciousness in carefully selected subjects. And we did build a lab.
Today's guest has made a huge impact on my grief from the very early days after losing my dad.
He knew that if physicalism is correct, there can't be any survival, period. And yet that there were people here and there around the planet producing what seemed to be evidence suggestive of postmortem survival. So in his typical way, he convened a working group of those sample of those people, including us, to present and discuss evidence for survival.
His guest is Dr. Edward F. Kelly. He is a professor in the Division of Perceptual Studies, DOPS, at University of Virginia.
And we're going to have to make a much more radical overhaul of our science-based picture of the world.
So, very excited for today's conversation.
Hey everyone!
I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually, and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality.
Today I am speaking with Dr. Ed Kelly of DOPS, the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. Welcome, Dr. Kelly.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So I'd love to hear a bit about your current role at DOPS.
Well, I'm one of the senior members, shall we say, kind of headed toward the exit. I actually came to DOPS with the expectation of creating an experimental program, and in particular, neuroimaging studies of psi phenomena and altered states of consciousness in carefully selected subjects. And we did build a lab, quite a good state-of-the-art EEG facility. And we did some work with it, not as much as I had hoped to get done. But I've now actually passed on leadership of the lab to a guy named David Acunzo, who's better equipped than I am really to lead the lab at this point. And I've spent really most of my effort over the last 20 years plus has gone into attempting to identify some sort of expanded theory that will allow us to understand how things like psi phenomena and survival could happen, and that is not in conflict with what we've learned about the physical world. So we've already published 3 large books leading in this direction, and we're starting to work on a 4th, which I think will potentially be the best in the sense that it actually gets to something quite concrete of that sort. So that's what I do now. Otherwise, just try to keep an eye on things and chime in where I usefully can.
So first of all, what are the names of the books so our listeners can find them?
Irreducible Mind was the first. That was 2007. Beyond Physicalism, 2015. and Consciousness Unbound in 2021. They all have subtitles. I'll give you the subtitle for the last one: Liberating Mind from the Tyranny of Materialism. That's the general drift of the whole subject. Basically, to reject physicalism, the prevailing contemporary science-based picture of the world, and to find an expanded picture that will enable us to recognize and explain, perhaps, things like extreme forms of creativity, psi phenomena, mystical experiences.
And so, were you originally a materialist?
Yeah, I mean, not in any sort of carefully thought out philosophical sense, but I went to graduate school in the 1960s, and physicalism was just part of the atmosphere that you absorbed passively, like the fish in water kind of thing. Not that we talked about it at all. That was the view of things in that world, and I it's where we've all grown up with, really, in the modern era. Our elementary and high schools are already filled with it. It's given to us as, hey guys, this is the way things are. Get used to it, as bleak as it is. And most of us kind of quietly do that. I certainly did until late in graduate school. Two things happened that kind of woke me up from my dogmatic slumbers. First was in my dissertation research. I won't go into any detail, but I was working with a group doing automated content analysis. And we had recognized that it would be very good if our system could recognize the main senses of high frequency words in English. And we set about to do that. We made a big concordance of about 500,000 words of text. And we set about writing little computer programs that would look around in the context and pick which sense was there. And the big point was, for me, I mean, it did modestly well, practically speaking, but it showed me that prevailing ideas of how language works were wrong. The basic idea is that words have pre-established meanings, and in any particular context, you pick which one is actually there. And that is clearly not how it works. Words have many fewer but much more general meanings that people grasp and understand and can then deploy into an infinite variety of novel but appropriate circumstances, including metaphorical ones, where the words are being inappropriately from the literal point of view, but enable us to understand new things in terms of old things. Poets have known about this, of course, for centuries, but it violated the then prevailing approach in the computational theory of the mind. So I was really disillusioned by this about the computational theory of the mind. And shortly afterward, I got a call from my mother on a weekday, which was very unusual, at the office, informing me that my sister had become a medium. My older sister, my only sibling. And she didn't quite say this, but it was obvious that she was a little uneasy about that and figured, since I was a graduate student in psychology, I'd know all about it and could reassure her. Well, I didn't have the slightest idea what she was talking about. I had to go to the library, at which point I discovered not only some things about mediumship, but also that there's this big literature of experimental parapsychology where people were using the kinds of methods we had been taught to study things experimentally, to study things that, if physicalism were true, shouldn't happen, period. And yet they seem to be happening. And for me, that was quite intriguing, interesting, not terrifying or horrifying. And so I began a conversation, exchanging mail, snail mail, that is, with J.B. Rhine down in Durham. J.B. Rhine, had been in the psych department of Duke University since the late 1920s and had painfully, slowly developed a set of simple experimental and statistical methods that he used to study some of these phenomena. So at the time, this is the early 1970s, his lab, which is now outside of Duke, nearby, was still the main center of experimental parapsychology in the United States and probably in the world, really. So anyway, he invited me to join the staff, which I did. And shortly afterward, I met a guy who was probably one of the best subjects ever to come into a parapsychology lab. He was at the time, he was a student at Yale Law School. He was discovered there basically by one of my former teachers as an undergraduate in psychology at Yale, who knew that I was now working in parapsychology, in which he had developed an interest himself, and he arranged for this guy to come down and visit us at J.B. Rhine's lab. And it became clear right away that he could do some of these experimental tasks at very unusual levels of success. For example, we had this little 4-button electronic contraption at the time that had been built by our research director, Helmut Schmidt. He was a physicist, had worked at Boeing for many years, but developed an interest in parapsychology and invented this little contraption. It was a little box, had 4 brightly colored lights and 4 correspondingly colored buttons, and the subject's task was pick the button that corresponded to the target that would be picked by the contraption. And in the absence of a subject, this thing behaved as expected, given the statistics of that situation, 25% hits plus or minus a little bit. Anyway, he on the first day he came to the Rhine lab, he sat with us in the library for about an hour telling us about his life history, and would reach out occasionally and push a button. And by the end of the hour, he had 180 hits and 508 trials, which is over 35%. No one had ever seen a scoring rate like that on that machine before, and that was really just kind of the beginning for him. We did experiments with him over the next year and a half or so and published a bunch of papers about him, tremendously successful. So that was my real introduction to the subject. I read a good bit of the experimental literature and was moderately persuaded, that it looks like there's really something there. But it's quite different to have it right in your face, rather than reading it in journal reports and that sort of thing. So that was the end of my allegiance to, well, it wasn't really the end. I mean, I think like most people who come to parapsychology from a science perspective, the hope is that, okay, this shouldn't be happening, but maybe with a little adjustment somewhere, we can correct this problem. And that's certainly where I started out. But over the next several decades, I gradually became convinced that no, the problems are way worse than I thought at the beginning. And we're going to have to make a much more radical overhaul of our science-based picture of the world if we're going to fix it. So that's where we are, basically. In fact, let me just say in advance that where I've gotten to, and I'm not saying this is demonstrated to be the right idea, I think that once one abandons physicalism, there's really no stable place to stop short of what amounts to its metaphysical opposite. That is some kind of idealism in which consciousness is the foundation of everything, and all of our experience of what looks like a stable surrounding world that we mostly share, all that comes out somehow from consciousness, but not our individual consciousness, some much greater consciousness that I personally think answers to most people's traditional ideas about something like a God or highest being or highest, most complex consciousness. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. That's the result of the books.
Well, I'm going to definitely have some questions about that, but I want to ask you a few more questions about working with J.B. Rhine at the Rhine Institute, or I guess it wasn't called the Rhine Institute then. It was for Duke, I know that, but
The Institute
what
for
was it called, the Rhine
Parapsychology. Hmm?
Institute for Parapsychology?
Yeah, it was the only existing subdivision of his Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man. That
Wow,
tells you something about
okay.
JB right away.
Yeah, I mean, I know the whole history is fascinating. And so, one of my questions then, first of all, who was the person that stood out? Was that Hubert Pierce?
He
Did
was
I have
one
that
of
name right?
Ryan's,
Gunther Pratt.
yeah. Gaither Pratt was a very good guy that my wife and I knew, who ended his career actually working with Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. But he started out with J.B. Ryan and was really, I think, one of the major forces in the development of that whole tradition. And Pierce was, again, one of the best of the early subjects. They started out working with exceptional subjects, kind of went over toward working, like most of psychology, with convenience samples of undergraduates and that sort of stuff later on. And I think that was a big mistake myself. I think the smart way to study unusual abilities is to find people who have them rather than just hoping any old person will do. And that's certainly the way I've pursued my own career. Yeah, Pierce. This was an interesting early example, actually. The experimental reports on Pierce were published, and then came a book by a man named Hansel, who was very anti-parapsychology, and he's quite candid about his approach. He says early on in that book, well, we know these phenomena are impossible, therefore, any alternative explanation of how the results occurred will do. And so he gave his own description of the how Pierce succeeded, which it turned out was inconsistent with the geometry of the buildings and this kind of stuff. Reviews of his book pointed these things out, but he never changed his mind. He's an example of a sizable number of people, scientists supposedly, who have very firm ideas about what's possible and just cannot abide the idea that these phenomena are real. That's their problem.
Despite the data.
No. Yeah, despite the data.
And what was, I'm going to ask you one more Ryan question before we get into Division of Perceptual Studies, but was there an experiment there over your time that you would consider the most remarkable that you witnessed?
Well, certainly for me, all the work that we did with this one person, Bill Delmore, just altered my worldview. We did a bunch of experiments. The first time he came down, he lived in my house for 6 weeks, and all kinds of weird stuff was going on, even while we were doing these things in the lab. He then went away for a while. We got a small grant from Harvard University to do experimental studies with him. He took a leave of absence from law school, and we did a bunch of studies, particularly involving playing cards. And they included both ESP studies, where he was attempting to identify individually selected cards placed in black envelopes and that sort of thing. And we also did some PK experiments with him, where he would shuffle one deck to match another pre-randomized deck. And he succeeded at these things. Well, at the ESP thing, at about 3 times chance expectation. That is 3 exact hits out of 52 instead of the expected 1, and often with many excess number hits as well. And in fact, there was even a very small subset of trials in which he felt so good about his response that he would say in advance, and I'm sure this is right. There were 20 of those trials out of, I forget how many, 2,392, I think it was altogether, 46 runs, in which he said that. And of those 20, 14 were exact hits, and the other 6 were all partial hits. 5 of them were number hits in which he got the suit wrong, and the last was a suit hit in which he missed the number by 1. So when he had that special feeling of confidence about his response, he was right on it every single time.
Yeah, and there's
Yeah,
just
I mean,
no
less than
normal, our
0.05.
definition materialist normal
Yeah.
explanation. That's remarkable.
There was an attempt to explain all this away by a guy named George Hansen, who, in collaboration with one of the critics of the field, Richard Wiseman, advanced the idea that, well, what this guy did was he was able to smuggle mirrors into the experimental room and attach them to his shoes in such a way that we wouldn't notice that he was poking these mirrors under the desk, which was about at the bottom, about that high above the floor, in such a way as to actually glimpse the target as it was being taken out of a drawer full of 10 decks all shuffled together by my experimental colleague, Contamani. And at a certain point, they came to the lab in an attempt to verify that this was the case, failed miserably, and wrote a semi-apologetic letter to the Journal of Parapsychology saying, in effect, well, if the experiments were really done the way they were described, then that probably didn't account for it. That's the kind of stuff that we routinely have to deal with.
Yeah, in one sense, it's good because then when grieving skeptics start hearing the level of examination, but it's also, I feel like there's a group of skeptics who have gotten so much data. And instead of saying, well, maybe something's happening that we don't understand, they're still saying it's not true. And that's, to me, unscientific.
Well, I agree. For some people, this physicalism business really amounts to a secular religion. They believe in it, just like other people believe in Islam or Christianity. And anybody who challenges it is a heretic who needs to be punished. It's that bad sometimes. Not always by any means. So there's a small number of these professional skeptics who are very noisy, get a lot of public attention. But most scientists, I think, really just don't know anything about the subject. Probably would be skeptical initially, but if they got a chance to see it, would probably take the evidence seriously, or more seriously than they do when they don't know anything about it. Anyway, I think we're slowly winning this battle. Partly, I must say, because we're not alone anymore. Some of the recent things that have happened, first of all, physicalism is based on late 19th century physics, the near perfection of the original scheme of nature set forth by people like Galileo and Newton. But physics has moved on. There's been relativity and quantum theory, which drastically erode the foundations of that traditional viewpoint. There's a lot of argumentation going on still among physicists about how to think about all that, but it does definitely injure that traditional point of view. More to the point, really, I think, is the last few decades in the world of consciousness studies. A basic corollary of the physicalist model is that everything in our minds and consciousness is manufactured by neurophysiological stuff going on in our brains and bodies. And that view has come under a lot of pressure from philosophers of science. The idea has been around since the middle of the 19th century, that we have no idea how to get from electrochemical things in brains to conscious experience. But it was really in 1996 or so that David Chalmers put that issue in a way that got a lot of attention in the philosophical community. The hard problem of consciousness. That's his label, and that caught on. And I think at this point, it's fair to say that many, perhaps even a majority of philosophers of mind are convinced, number one, that we do not yet have a physicalist account of consciousness, and perhaps even number two, that we can never achieve one. And that's beginning to bleed over into neuroscience. For example, Christoph Koch, the primary student of Francis Crick, one of the heavy-duty spokesmen for physicalism in the 20th century, said in his book, Consciousness, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist, page 119, if you have the book. I used to believe that consciousness is manufactured by neurophysiological processes in the brain. Just see my previous book, Quest for Consciousness. I no longer believe it. I mean, that's a big deal, and he's not alone. In fact, a really interesting thing happened. I don't know if you read any of this stuff, the integrated information theory of consciousness, about that? It's a neuroscientific theory of consciousness.
Yeah, explain it.
Yeah, there's no way I can give a real description of it, but it's got a couple of unique properties. It really starts from consciousness. They attempt to identify sort of basic properties of consciousness. Then they consider what kinds of properties of physical systems might go with these properties of consciousness. And then they elaborate a whole long, complicated story, which has evolved. We're up to, I think, version 4.0 of it now. But it has verged upon things like panpsychism. Most neuroscientists have thought that consciousness can only occur in conjunction with central nervous systems of a rather elaborate type. A few people thought, well, consciousness may be appearing further down. John Searle, philosopher, said, anybody who thinks dogs aren't conscious hasn't met my dog, Ludwig, an allusion to Wittgenstein. And even he was rebuked by a woman in Spain who's apparently one of the world's greatest experts on slugs or something of that sort, that contrary to what John Searle thinks, she's convinced that slugs are conscious to some degree. And of course, there are people who are advocating that plants may have some sort of primitive awareness, maybe even single cells or organelles within single cells. There's a huge organismic turn going on in theoretical biology as we speak that is pushing consciousness further and further down into the tree of life and helping to explain evolution in that way. There's going to be a big shift shortly in the theory of evolution. The standard theory is going to be modified in a way that reintroduces Lamarckianism, the idea that certain aspects of creatures' experience, the basic idea is that creatures have to be able to adjust to unpredictable environments, and that necessarily involves some sort of capacity to register what those conditions are in the environment, to distinguish between positive and negative ones, and to adjust behavior voluntarily so as to pick the good ones and avoid the bad ones. And that under some circumstances, that voluntary behavior produces changes that pass into the genome and can be expressed in succeeding generations. This makes organisms participants in evolution in a way that the standard theory does not accommodate, but it's going to have to change. There are well documented biological results now showing that the genome can be modified by things that happen to organisms. Anyway, that was a long answer.
It's fascinating.
It's kind of right on the edge of things that I'm currently working on, so it's right at the top of my head.
Oh, it's fascinating. I had no idea about that, about evolution. May I ask how you're working on it? Are you doing experiments? It almost sounds like a type of bringing in like biocentrism, that consciousness creates material in the first place. I mean, it definitely, maybe I'm going too far with that, but yeah, how are you working on that? Are you doing
Well,
a specific
I'm just reading
experiment
some of this
or?
literature and bringing it into, my own writing about these things, not working in that area myself. But I've identified some
Got
of
it.
the key players and actually am in contact with some of those. It's going to happen for sure. And a really interesting aspect of this evolution business is that it's like parapsychology in being kind of right at the core of a huge cultural, hot potato controversy. And the standard theory has been defended for decades by people who are firm believers in physicalism and the standard neo-Darwinian synthesis, and who have had the capacity, because of their academic standing, to prevent these new findings from appearing in journals, in textbooks, preventing people from getting grants to do more work on certain kinds of contrary research. It's got a lot in common with the parapsychology story. But it is going to change for sure, and it'll happen pretty soon.
That's exciting. And what do you think is their reason? I mean, same as with materialists. Why would people want to block evidence and data?
I don't think of them as just inherently malicious. I think they honestly believe that they know the right answer and are just trying to prevent it from getting corrupted by, bad people. It's that kind of thing. And it's because they have just tremendous emotional investment in the status quo.
That makes sense. Yeah, as you said, like believers, like true believers, as would with any religion. It's very, yeah, it's a personal attachment, even if they aren't consciously aware of that. Well, I'd love to get into University of Virginia now. So, when did you first get involved with them?
Well, actually, it was when I was still working with J.B. Ryan. I made a visit to Charlottesville because I had read about some of Ian Stevenson's early studies of kids who remember things about previous lives. And I was interested in that, so I went up to Charlottesville and talked with him about it at some length. I think I probably was one of the people who got him interested early on in the idea of building a cumulative database about the cases that could be used to generate and test hypotheses about what goes with what. Anyway, I went back and I told J.B. Ryan about this, and J.B. informed me that he thought Ryan was the most dangerous person in parapsychology. Basically, because Ryan was totally devoted to experimental research. I mean, he was, in some ways, very naive, a very tough, disciplined, determined guy. He was really the right guy in the right place at the right time to build a experimental tradition and defend it against all comers. I mean, that was JB. And it's just because Ian was doing something that he didn't respect, that he thought he was dangerous. I disagree completely. I think Ian Stevenson will be recognized ultimately as another Darwin, introducing and developing a very important line of research that shows very different things about what kind of creatures we are and all that. We shall see in
I
100
hope. I hope
years.
he ends up as respected as Darwin. That will change our
Yeah.
whole paradigm of. So at DOPS, what are some of the experiments you've worked on that really stood out to you? That really most strongly challenged the materialist paradigm?
Well, that was really all behind me by the time I moved up to Charlottesville. We built our lab, used a little bit. I was not able to complete any experiments that really altered anything for me. I think that lab will get a lot more and better use now. But the other kinds of work going on at DOPS are, again, contrary to J.B. Ryan's point of view, I think also extremely important. They include work on things like near-death experiences, these cases of the reincarnation type, past life memories. Things, apparitions, crisis apparitions. It's all important. In fact, one of the big lessons is not to focus exclusively on any one experiment or type of evidence, but to see how the different kinds of evidence all fit together in a larger pattern that points consistently in the direction of an understanding of the world bigger than physicalism that allows these things to happen. That's, to me, the single most important thing going on now, certainly as far as my own work.
If you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened.
But there's plenty going on at DOPS, and I strongly urge anybody who's interested in this stuff, just Google the words DOPS UVA, University of Virginia, and you'll go right to our website. And there's tons of information there.
Yeah, so I know you did some experiments with mediums. I'd love to hear a bit about those, and you also consider them not successful. So if you're okay talking about that, I'd love to talk a little bit about why and your plans going forward and some of the protocols as much as you're able to share.
Yeah. Well, mediumship, of course, has a very long history. Well, it's actually appeared all over the planet at various times and places. The part that gets particularly interesting to me really got going in the mid to late 19th century. William James, had an encounter with the medium Leonora Piper, who became for him his, what he called, one white crow. That is, if there's a proposition that all crows are white, that proposition can be falsified by the discovery of a single white crow. And for him, Mrs. Piper was the white crow, showing that contrary to expectations, it is possible under unknown conditions for some people to acquire information about things they could not possibly have learned about in any normal way.
The official quote by William James about Leonora Piper is, "If you wish to upset the law that all crows are black, you mustn't seek to show that no crows are. It is enough if you prove one single crow to be
He became convinced early on, and remained so throughout his life, that Mrs. Piper had that ability. And some of the, in the old days, reports were quite different from what they are like now. For example, the Society for Psychical Research included a man named Richard Hodgson, who was an Australian lawyer. He came to the United States, I think at the behest of William James, to study Mrs. Piper. And he did so intensely for years and years, even going to the extent of having detectives following her around to make sure she wasn't cheating and learning about people who are about to come to her seances and that sort of thing. And Hodgson himself started out being very skeptical of postmortem survival, but was convinced by Mrs. Piper. Things he saw with her that, no, I have to change my opinion about this, that survival really can happen. So in particular, he wrote a huge report in 1898, published in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, in which he goes through a vast amount of this stuff with Mrs. Piper. It's really something to read today. And there are other papers of a similar scale. Now, what interested me, apart from the bearing of Mrs. Piper on the survival issue, was the fact that she was very clearly in odd states when she was doing this stuff. I mean, she would typically go through some sort of shuddering process, kind of collapse onto the person sitting next to her. She would usually go that way, write something with one hand to one sitter, occasionally speaking to another at the same time, and on a few occasions even writing to a third with the other hand. If you can imagine this all kind of going on at once. And later things showed that, for example, if somebody held a bottle of ammonia under her nose, she wouldn't even flinch. I mean, for most of us, one whiff of ammonia, wow, and you're you're out of whatever state you were in. Not her. So, I mean, something was going on there that must have had profound physiological accompaniments. And it has always interested me to try to find someone who could do that sort of thing and study them physiologically. So that was what we were trying to. This started actually around 2019. We worked with Bob Ginsberg at Forever Family. He provided me with a list of a dozen or so people that he thought would be appropriate to work with, and I interviewed them all. Picked a smaller number who agreed that they would be able to operate in the conditions I described with this receive report, separating a receive period in which they quietly sit and then a report period in which they talk and all that, which we know creates havoc for EEG recordings and all that. So the hope was that this would enable us to do good physiologically meaningful recordings during periods when they were getting information, and we could categorize those in terms of how good they were and so on. That was the idea.
To get physical, like see when they, like where in the brain
that's
responded, when they were accurate versus not, like understanding the physiology of it. Okay.
That's the hope. The whole thing was, I mean, it was complicated from the start. It's really the most unsuccessful experimental story of my career. There were difficulties from the beginning, and the worst, of course, was that COVID intervened right in the middle of the study. We were interrupted for 2 years in the middle of this not very big study. It only involved ultimately 5 mediums. The one medium that I was most eager to work with was a person who had been very successful in a prior study and who I knew was able to get into some sort of trance-like state of the sort that I specifically wanted to study. That person was never able to get to Charlottesville to do the study. And
oh no,
the psi part really was pretty much of a bust, I have to say.
Meaning, were they not getting accurate information, you're saying? Or
well, I mean, in terms of the study that we did with the sitters that we had and the deceased persons who were involved, the mediumistic portion itself was not successful, period. And that just makes it harder, less promising to even look at the physiological data. We did establish that we could do the recordings in the way. And by the way, I mean, it was absolutely clear as the study was going on. I could just look at the terminal, look at the EEGs that were coming in. I would know whether it was a report period or a receive period, because the recordings were so catastrophically worse during the report periods. So the idea was a plausible one. It might have worked, but it didn't really work. All but Joe, actually, of the mediums, complained that they found it really difficult to segregate receiving from reporting in that way.
what do you mean receiving, like when they're receiving information? You were testing the physiology of when they're getting the information versus when they're sharing it.
Yeah, that was the idea,
Okay.
because it's when they're just sitting quietly and taking in information that we get good EEG recordings.
Have you concluded, though, mediumship is genuine still?
Well, I've been convinced that mediumship can be genuine. It's in terms of the great mediums of the 19th and early 20th century. And there's still, some good mediumship going on today, I'm sure. But today's mediumship is mostly very different from that of the great mediums of the 19th and early 20th century. It's much more like channeling, typically, without any obvious altered state involved. And some mediums, I'm sure, are much better than others. Bob Ginsberg and Forever Family, as well as Winbridge, Windbridge Institute out in the southwest, have their own kind of certification procedures they use to, mediums come in and do actual tasks and are rated on their ability to do those tasks. And, we wanted to use to work with people who had demonstrated capacity to perform. And actually, most of the mediums we worked with were certified by either one or most times both of those organizations. So we relied on them to guarantee the quality of mediumship. I'm sure they're quite capable under normal conditions of.
What do you think was the issue with this one? And then you have a plan for making some changes to it going forward. Am I right about that?
Well, the problem with this one clearly is that it's just too difficult we might find somebody like Joe who seemed able to do that and work more intensively in some way with a person like that or other persons who can. Or else we're going to have to find some other way of trying to separate recording from reporting, maybe in a more piecemeal sort of way. I will not be the person who makes those decisions at this point, although I'll certainly consult with David Acunzo, the new lab director, about how to do it. He's got a lot of interests of his own, however, so I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen at DOPS in the future in terms of mediumship research. But David and Marina Weiler in particular are certainly interested in the subject and would like to carry it forward if we can figure out a good way to do it. That hasn't really happened as yet.
Yeah. When I think about it, I could see it when mediums, some of the best give readings, it's pouring out of their mouth the second they're getting it. So It might be almost a time thing. I don't know. I find it interesting, and I also find it genuine to hear, kind of go against the skeptical mindset that, parapsychologists say everything's right. You openly admit when something doesn't work. And I think that's important. People hear too, So at your time at DOPS, and tell me if you feel you've already covered this, is there some work you did that you are most excited to share with our listeners that maybe you would consider the biggest success of your time there?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly my principal occupation for the last 25 years has been writing these books, developing the books. I didn't write them all. They're edited volumes. Other people contributed huge amounts to all of them. This actually all got started in 1998. I had moved Emily and I had gotten married in 1998, and I would soon move to Charlottesville. Let me just mention that I actually left Ryan's lab after about a year and 5 months or something. Couldn't get along with JB and myself. He had no interest in physiological research. So I moved over to the electrical engineering department at Duke, worked there for about another 10 years in doing parapsychology and trying to develop a physiological research program. We had some good successes along the way. I thought we were on a good track. Then we got a new dean at the School of Engineering who was very hostile to parapsychology. He had been Bob John's assistant dean at Princeton, where, the PAIR lab was established, Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. So we had to leave, made a little nonprofit research institute, settled outside the university, went on for a few years. Well, I had to abandon that. I was married, had 2 kids at that time, I had to have some income. So I went back into mainstream research in somatosensory neurophysiology, neuroscience, studying human responses to tactile stimuli, temperature, pain, that sort of thing. And that was all okay. It had its subtle joys, but I always wanted to find a way back into psychical research. So in 1998, after Emily and I had been married, we were invited by Mike Murphy, the co-founder of Esalen, Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. It was and kind of still is the sort of mecca for humanistic and transpersonal psychology. Mike was a Renaissance man, kind of universal scholar in the style of people like Frederick William Henry Myers and William James of the Society for Psychical Research. He knew that if physicalism is correct, there can't be any survival, period. And yet that there were people here and there around the planet producing what seemed to be evidence suggestive of postmortem survival. So in his typical way, he convened a working group of those sample of those people, including us, to present and discuss evidence for survival. So we formed this group. We went out there. The typical MO is to spend a week, basically, at Esalen, most of the time discussing evidence of whatever, in our case, survival. And some of those fellowships go on and some kind of peter out quickly. This one went on for the next 20 years. After the first couple of annual meetings, we had come to the conclusion that, well, we have some internal differences about survival, but we're all convinced that psi is real, parapsychological phenomena, that physicalism is incorrect at its foundation somehow. And we hatched a kind of two-stage plan. Stage one was to try and assemble in one place a lot of evidence showing that physicalism just isn't up to the job, that there are important things about human psychophysical capacities that it cannot explain. And then phase two would be to try to figure out how it could be modified in order to correct those deficiencies. So the first phase led to Irreducible Mind. And in creating it, we basically kind of followed the template that had been set down by F.W.H. Myers in his book, Human Personality, if only he had stopped there, and its survival of bodily death. Had it not included that last part, I think it would be more widely recognized than it currently is as a work of genius in one of the great historical psychology books. So we revisited a lot of his topics in light of the subsequent century of research, most of it really published in biomedical journals, scattered all over the place. So we ended up with chapters on the kind of current situation in psychology and neuroscience. Emily produced a short, the best short summary of Myers's views and his history and so on. And then we went on to consider a bunch of these topics. Emily has a big chapter on psychophysiological influence, starting with things where the standard physicalist line seems plausible, and gradually progressing toward things that are harder and harder to explain in those terms, such as, in the end, things like geometrically shaped hypnotic blisters, or stigmata, people who are able to visualize intensely the wounds inflicted upon Christ and develop similar wounds on their own bodies. Maternal impressions.
Have you seen that? Is that actually a real thing? I mean, I've heard of it theoretically, but
yeah, there are hundreds of cases in the literature, including some modern ones. Anyway, stuff like that. So that's one. I mean, what we're doing here basically is looking for. Well, let me go back a step. This is important. This is the kind of philosophical basics of the situation. Everybody agrees that under normal conditions, physical things, stuff going on in the brain, and mental things tend to correlate pretty closely. We know, for example, we all know that if you get whacked on the head hard enough, or drink too much, or ingest a psychedelic, or maybe develop an invasive brain tumor, mental things change. So there can be no real doubt that physical stuff causes mental changes. But now, what about in the other direction? Suppose I'm listening to a lecture by some physicalist and I'm getting irritated and I want a question. I develop the urge to raise my hand and ask a question. My hand goes up in the air. That's my wife getting a drink out of the refrigerator. Ice.
No worries. No worries.
That looks like mental to physical causation, does it not? As we normally experience. Well, no, says the physicalist. You see, you just haven't quite understood what was really going on there. You see, that urge to raise your hand is really nothing more than a neuroelectric process in your brain. That's what caused your hand to go up. Physical causes physical, no problem. Now, that kind of argument is extremely difficult, impossible really to rebut in an everyday context such as raising your arm. And it sounds plausible. But our task was to identify things that resist or defy explanation in those terms. That is, things that look as though they could not possibly be accomplished by an unaided brain. So, first batch, of course, first on everybody's list is all the psi phenomena and all that. That's, definitional, really. What makes them so objectionable to so many, determined physicalists. Then there's this psychophysical influence stuff. And in extreme cases, we're talking about psychokinesis, where somebody has a physical effect on something in the world without, using their motor system or some technological, adjustment to it. Anyway, other things we talked about, we have chapters on memory. Everybody tends to think that memories are stored in the brain, by adjustments of some sort in the physiology of the nervous system. We have a chapter by a man named Alan Gauld who spent a large part of his life studying this subject, in which he argues that things are not at all that straightforward. A lot of his arguments are parallel to ones being offered by philosophers of mind for the inability of physicalism to account for any kind of conscious experience, including memory. And he talks some about survival. I mean, clearly, if postmortem survival is a fact, then memories are not stored in the brain, period. What might be stored in the brain is some sort of pointer to a memory that exists somewhere else. And we have a big chapter on psychological automatisms and what are called secondary centers of consciousness. This goes together with the literature on multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, as they're now called. And these in particular involve some very well documented cases in which two or more personalities appear to be associated with a single organism. They can be there concurrently rather than sequentially, sharing stuff in the nervous system that supports language and all of that. They can be very different in terms of their basic personalities, their interests, their knowledge, their skills. They may have different allergies, different eyeglass prescriptions, all of which poses huge challenge for the typical view of things. Then we have a really important chapter on out-of-body and near-death experiences, again, led by Emily. And what I would focus on there, the chapter covers the whole subject, but to me the most significant, interesting part of it, in terms of what we're talking about, is that a sizable proportion of near-death experiences occur under extreme physiological conditions that virtually all neuroscientists believe should prevent the occurrence of any experience whatsoever, let alone the most transformative experience some of these persons report having had in their entire lives. These are conditions such as deep general anesthesia, which after all is expected to prevent you from having any experience, sometimes accompanied by cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest is an absolutely brutal physiological event which results very shortly in essentially silence of the nervous system. It just stops working altogether. In particular, all these cortical areas that are associated with the details of everyday experience. Sensory experience coming from, the auditory area or the visual area or the olfactory area or whatever. And that's all gone, and yet people are having these very intense, detailed, complicated experiences. They're essentially mystical experiences occurring under less than optimal circumstances where you almost have to die in order to have it. Anyway, and what those show, in my opinion, and there's one more stage to this, sometimes those experiences include reports of verifiable things that happened either, say, in the operating theater or maybe down the street or down the hall in a locked room or somewhere else altogether. These are what we call time anchors that link the experience to the time of apparent unconsciousness when the person should not have been able to have any experience. And they always follow, never precede, the period of unconsciousness. So what these show, in my opinion, is that minds can, occasionally at least, function in the absence of a functioning brain. And that removes the biggest obstacle to postmortem survival, what Gardner Murphy used to call the immovable obstacle to the possibility of survival in the presence of irresistible force of the cumulative evidence for it, that all experience seem to require a functioning brain. But we know now from these NDE cases, this special subclass, it's like 20% of all the cases. Bruce Grayson has 1,000 NDEs, of which a couple hundred, 230 or something are of this type. These things are occurring by the millions worldwide. They're occurring because we're learning about them, because we're getting better and better at rescuing people from the borderlands of death through advances in resuscitation medicine. We're going to see more and better cases of this sort, I believe, going forward. They come right out of the heartland of biomedical science, and I think it's there in the near future that psychical research will have its biggest impact on science. Anyway, we then have big chapters on both genius in extreme forms like that of the Indian mathematician Ramanujan, And this guy recapitulated most of the history of Western math without ever having had a class in the subject. He's just an astonishing character, and filled with crazy stuff like dreams, in which his goddess would come and dip her finger in a bucket of blood and write equations on a whiteboard, which he would then wake up and write down in his notebook, stuff like that. Well, this is very much in line with Myers's theory of genius. There's a chapter in his book on genius, which is itself a work of genius, in my estimation, that we're just beginning to catch up with. And then we have a chapter on mystical experience, and I should say a little more about that. This is something that is not so obviously in conflict with physicalism, but it's a subject that even more than creativity has been shabbily treated by modern psychology and biomedical science. Hardly anybody since William James has paid any attention to it whatsoever, and most of those who do apparently are interested only in demeaning and pathologizing it as some kind of aberration. And yet, as we know, a large portion of the world's traditional philosophical systems are mystically informed. These people, from Vedanta onward, viewed mystical experiences essentially as windows into normally inaccessible, deeper parts of what is real, and have structured their philosophical theories accordingly. So one of the main deliverances for me of this first phase of our project, and really intensified ever since, is that modern Western psychological and biomedical science needs to pay a lot more attention to these kinds of experiences and to understand how to enable them to occur. It's very clear, in particular from the NDE work, that people who have these kinds of experiences very often, not always, become better people as a result. They get less interested in the usual stuff like, fame and fortune, beating their competitors, all that kind of stuff. Become much more like what most traditional religions have always advocated. People who are community oriented, service oriented, concerned about the planet and their fellow human beings and that sort of stuff. And I think actually that this will happen in coming decades. To me, it's the most exciting area of research going forward. Finding out, using conventional neuroimaging techniques and so on, what conditions in the brain and body permit the expression of these normally hidden higher capabilities of our big minds that we usually don't even know are there. And that could have enormous personal and collective good impacts. So, okay, well, that was the easy part. I mean, that was basically a huge clerical job, going out and finding all this stuff and kind of putting it together in a coherent form. But now comes the really hard part. Okay, physicalism isn't up to it. What might be? That is, how might the world really be put together in such a way that allows these things cataloged in Irreducible Mind to occur? So that was the next big stage, and we fumbled around for a couple of years trying to figure out how to go about that. And we ultimately assembled a team that allowed us to investigate in depth a number of worldviews or conceptual systems or metaphysical systems that specifically endorsed and set out to explain the occurrence of some of the things that we study at DOPS, for example, that are studied in psychical research. And we eventually produced a second book, Beyond Physicalism, in 2015, that surveyed the history of these kinds of psychological pictures that we call filter or permission theories, that have the basic idea that our minds and consciousness are actually much bigger than we normally know and express themselves through the brain and body in a sort of fitful and piecemeal fashion, depending on what's going on in the brain. So we have a history of such systems in the West. We had chapters on specific mystically informed religious type philosophies like Neoplatonism, Patanjali's Yoga and Vedanta, Kashmiri Shaivism. These were either done or assisted by people who are specialists in those areas, or religious studies members of our team. We also looked at several Western philosophical systems, including Leibniz's monadology, modified in a way that allows it to explain more about parapsychological stuff. Charles Sanders Peirce, who was a colleague of William James, took science survival completely seriously, thought his metaphysics could explain it. And possibly most importantly, I think, Alfred North Whitehead. This is one of the towering intellects of the 20th century, initially in logic and math, developed his own theory of relativity, a contender to Einstein's, saw clearly very early that these developments, relativity and quantum theory, which he was somewhat familiar with, undermined the traditional basis of physicalism and attempted to elaborate a system of his own which would explain not only the new stuff, but everything about human experience. He saw the need to go in that direction and elaborated in several stages a system of that sort. Our guy, Eric Weiss, tried to combine Whitehead with the Indian sage Sri Aurobindo. I'm not sure he was terribly successful in that, but I think it was a good thing to attempt. And we're working more in that direction now, actually. Then we also had, though, chapters, from three very well-known physicists. One is Henry Stapp, was one of the founders of quantum theory, who has his own theory of brain-mind interaction. So he lays out that theory and also shows how he thinks it could explain most, if not quite all, of the phenomena of interest. The one that stumped him, by the way, was Joseph of Cupertino. This is a 17th century Catholic saint who was observed on hundreds of occasions by literally thousands of people, mainly in daylight, many of whom were not true believers in Catholicism, but skeptical or even hostile witnesses who could not deny what they saw happening, which was not in the least bit subtle. This guy would on occasion rise meters in the air, as high as 30 meters, I think, on the most extreme occasion, stay there for times ranging from seconds to hours, end up perched in a small tree, on a branch of a small tree hundreds of yards away, that sort of thing. Henry attempted initially to assimilate that, taking it serious. I'm not sure he ever was convinced that it really happened, but I am. Joseph is not alone. There are other cases not as extreme as his. But he, I think, found we never really quite got to the bottom of this. It happened at a time when Henry was actually quite ill, and I was not able to have the kind of detailed interactions I would have liked to have with him about it. But he changed his mind about how to explain it. Instead of trying to do it in the context of his regular theory, he changed his theory. He suggested the theory might be changed in such a way that this was not really done by Joseph himself, but by nature. And by nature, I think we can understand Henry was thinking big mind, not Joseph's individual mind, that for some reason, big mind was, how shall I say it, was prompted to take action itself. So that's a possible growing edge of all of that. Anyway, we then had a chapter by a man named Harold Ottmansbacher, a longtime colleague of Henry's, who's also a quantum theorist, very knowledgeable about philosophy of mind and cognitive neuroscience, who has had a lifelong interest, or most of his adult lifelong interest, in the dialogue that took place between Carl Jung, a psychoanalyst, and Wolfgang Pauli, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. This mostly went on in darkness. Very intense interaction over a period of years led to some joint publications. Harold is now kind of working on the implications of all that and has arrived at what he calls a dual aspect monism that he thinks is the way forward. Anyway, there's a chapter on that. And then from a different direction, we have Bernard Carr, who's a cosmologist, who got his Ph.D. with Stephen Hawking at Caltech. This is a seriously reputable mainstream cosmologist who has also been a president of the Society for Psychical Research, and who has his own theory, which comes from the string theory and cosmology side, involves multiple dimensions, which has a long history in psychical research. The idea is kind of like, if you recall Flatland, we're here in two dimensions, and maybe when we die, we go off into some third dimension or some higher order space where that can happen. So Bernard is working on the theory of
like
that
showing
sort.
Yeah.
Okay, and then at the end, we have a section where, together with Mike Murphy, I tried to put it all together, just try to see what were the common themes here, where is this all headed? And the conclusion is basically that in their somewhat differing ways, these different theories are all going in a quite similar direction, mainly toward some kind of realist form of idealism. And in particular, the one that appeals to me the most amounts to some kind of what's called evolutionary panentheism. This is a kind of theologically oriented version of idealism, which points
Can you
to the
explain what
existence.
idealism is? If everyone, I'm not sure if everyone knows what that means.
Idealism?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the word that you used.
Oh,
Which
yeah, yeah.
word?
Can you explain what idealism? Yeah,
Yeah,
idealism, please.
yeah.
Yeah.
Physicalism is the idea that the ultimate stuff is physical stuff, and everything has to be explained in that way. Idealism is the opposite idea, that what's fundamental at bottom is some kind of mentality, not an individual mentality probably, but some big mentality, and everything else has to come somehow from that. Now, this panentheism tries to split the difference between traditional theisms, in which there's a God as all-powerful being who creates everything and may or may not muck around with it afterward, versus pantheism, in which God is actually identified with everything that is, period. It's thought to come from Spinoza in particular in relatively modern times. Panentheism has a highest being of some sort, is involved in everything that happens, participates in it in some way. But there's something left over, kind of the relation of our minds to our bodies, that kind of a relationship. Anyway, a long story here. There's a wonderful book by Charles Hartshorne, who's an ally of Whitehead, and a man named Rees. It's called Philosophers Speak of God, in which he summarizes the basic tenets of pantheism and shows how various historical philosophers were headed in that direction, including William James. And that's the line that I take in Beyond Physicalism. By the way, there's another book by Lorelei Biernacki, who wrote the Shaivism chapter for Beyond Physicalism, and Philip Clayton is a main figure in contemporary speculative or natural theology, shall we say, showing that there are panentheistic currents in all of the world's major faiths, so that this is kind of there throughout and just needs to be kind of developed further. Anyway, so that's Beyond Physicalism. Now we've gone on. We published a third book in 2021, which really kind of continued both of the earlier two, the main themes of those. We have a first part on empirical stuff. We have state of the science summaries for near-death experiences, cases of the reincarnation type, and precognition, which is a uniquely difficult, philosophically difficult subject. Also in physics, it gets into things like time and how time fits into physics. And then there were 5 new theoretical contributions. One shows that Jung, as a result of mystical experiences he had late in life after a heart attack, was actually gravitating strongly toward the sort of panentheistic vision that we put forward in Beyond Physicalism. There's a chapter by a guy named Max Velmans, who's a very important guy in the world of cognitive neuroscience, advancing his version of dual aspect monism. There are 2 new chapters, one by Bernardo Kastrup, Kastrup. He's a very significant guy in this world of mind-brain metaphysics. He's the principal of a foundation called Essentia Foundation, which is full of good stuff that you can read there. He has a philosophy he calls analytic idealism, and he argues for that in his chapter in this book. And then there's one that I personally think is potentially the most important of the lot, by a man named Federico Fagin. He is the inventor of the silicon gate junction, designer and builder of several of the early microprocessors. a hero to the world microelectronic industry, who started having spontaneous mystical experiences about 35 years ago that convinced him early on that we have left something very important out of our picture of reality and we got to get it back in. And he attempts to do that in his chapter. That's his main purpose in life now, is developing those ideas and advancing them. And by the way, one of the sort of corollaries of his position, which is very significant right now, is that there will never be any such thing as artificial general intelligence based on current computational principles. And this is a guy who was a prime insider to that world and whose opinion cannot be ignored. So that's a little corollary of his effort.
Meaning that AI won't ever be conscious? It will just function sort of the way Google functions?
Well, not even
it will
that.
never
I mean, he thinks there are essential aspects of human intelligence that will never be captured in any of these systems based on current principles. I don't think he would go so far as to say we can never do it, but we'll have to do it in a quite different way from what's currently being done. And this, of course, flies in the face of enormous amounts of hype you see every day in the news, including a piece this morning that was particularly revolting to me. They've got a guy on the staff at New York Times, Kevin Roose, who just seems to swallow this hype with hardly any critical hesitation at all. Anyway, that's a side path. We also, there's a chapter on Hegel in Consciousness Unbound, which shows that he also fits into this pretty well, into this kind of panentheistic, possibly, or at least idealistic family of positions that we're trying to develop. Now, I'm about to run out of time here, but let me just say that that's not the end of the story. We've had a couple of meetings already, and we're going to have another bigger one this summer. I've identified a group of physicists, including Federico and Bernard, who think they see the pathway toward a fleshed out realist idealism. They share, and they're a minority among physicists at this point, but they think they have the correct slant on this that will resolve a bunch of paradoxes about quantum theory and so on. The basic move is to follow Heisenberg in elevating possibility to metaphysically to full parity with actuality. That is, in addition to the world that we experience around us, there is a normally hidden but still physical world of possibilities that is equally, if not more, important than the actual world. That's pre-space and time that accounts for the emergence of space and time in our experience. And that can potentially account for all the phenomena of interest. I mean, this basically creates a kind of parallel in physics to what Myers and James understood as a higher, normally inaccessible aspect of the human psyche, in which reside these normally inaccessible capacities for things like mystical experience and unusually intense creativity. So that's what we're pursuing, and we actually have a tentative plan for a book 4, which will elaborate on this and make it really concrete for the first time. So that's a preview of coming attractions. I think we're getting there.
Oh my God.
And let me say this.
I cannot wait to read book 4. This is just, I'm obsessed. That's all I spend my time thinking about. So thanks.
Well, thank you for saying
sorry,
that.
go on.
Let me end by just saying that for the first time in my rather long career, I feel like the winds of change are really starting to blow, probably just in time. I mean, at the beginning, in the little parapsychology rowboat, I felt like we were trying to steer the Titanic, and having very little success. Here we are, our civilization in the middle of all these icebergs all around. We got to do something to correct our course, or we're gonna die. Let's face it, it's gonna happen. We'll kill ourselves one way or the other. The way we're going, something has to change, or else. Well, now we got these other boats appearing in our neighborhood, like the philosophers of mind, like the physicists who are moving in the same direction, like speculative theologians who are moving in the same. We're all pulling in the same direction now, and for the first time, I feel there is some hope of arriving at something that will really enable us to replace this destructive, sterile, physicalist worldview with something that encompasses human spiritual needs and will let us save ourselves as a
If
civilization.
you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened. Although Dr. Edward Kelly is retiring, he still has his link at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies website. I will link to that in the show notes. And all 3 books, you can Google and find them wherever books are sold.